Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Defining Digital Twins, a special live event brought to you by the B1M in partnership with IES. I'm Fred Mills, I'm the founder of the B1M, and I'm going to be your host for this afternoon. And thankfully, I'm joined by a fantastic panel of experts who certainly know a thing or two about digital twins, particularly how to define them. So we're going to meet those people in just a moment. Just a little bit of housekeeping for you at the top of the session. So today we're going to run for about an hour. We're going to meet our panelists shortly. I'm then going to do a bit of a brief introduction around digital twins, just so some of you who aren't fully up to speed with the technology get a more of a base awareness to enable the conversation to move forward from there. We're then going into a planned Q&A discussion with our panelists. We've got some pre-prepared questions just to make sure that we really pull out the key themes and give you guys as well-rounded and informative a webinar as possible. We're then going into a live Q&A where we answer as many of you. We want to answer as many of your questions as possible. You'll see there's two features on Zoom. So there's a chat feature and also a Q&A feature. If you can get your comments coming into the Q&A feature, that'd be much appreciated. That's just so we can keep a nice clear list of questions and be very clear on where those questions are coming into. If there isn't a Q&A feature for some reason, do pop them in the chat and we will have a look through the chat as well, make sure your question gets answered. We are going to endeavour to answer as many of your questions as we can, including some that have been sent in via email beforehand. If we can't for any reason, we will endeavour to get back to you over email after the session. So without further ado, I want to introduce the fantastic group of people who I have joining me today. First off, we're going to come to Emma Hooper, who's joining us from RLB Digital. Emma, can you tell us a little bit about your role and where you're coming from with this?
Yes, Fred. So like you said, I'm Head of Information Management Strategy at RLB Digital. So my job is really around looking at strategies and principles around information management and really looking at how the science behind information, how it connects together, which we then implement on projects. And in addition to that, I'm also Vice Chair of NEMA and Building Smart UK and Ireland.
Fantastic. It's great to have you with us, and I really appreciate you being here. Next up, we have Richard Fletcher, who's joining us from IES. Can you give us a bit about your background, Richard? That would be fantastic.
Thank you. So my background, virtually throughout my entire working life, has been within the digitalisation of construction, either as a user of software for the first half of my career and then a seller of software effectively in the second half of my career. My role within IES is to work with our clients who are interested in building performance through the operational life cycle of their building, and I'll be speaking a little bit today about how we can use digital twins to improve building performance through decarbonisation.
Fantastic. It's great to have you here with us, Richard. We're also joined by Dan from BSI. How are you doing, Dan?
I'm doing all right, Fred. How are you?
Good, thank you. Can you give us a bit about your background on BSI and your role and how you come at the digital twin conversation?
Yeah, sure. So afternoon, everyone. Dan Roster from BSI, the British Standards Institution. As the UK's national standards body, we curate tens of thousands of standards in lots of different areas, and digital twins are no different. So part of my role is trying to understand where the UK's position is around all things digital in construction and liaise with various industry groups, government and others, just trying to make sure BSI is best placed to help in the right places. And in between bits and pieces, I'm also Vice President for the Chartered Institute of Architectural Technologists too.
Amazing. Great to have you with us, Dan. And last but by no means least, we have Mike Keeley joining us from Turner and Townsend. Mike, how are you doing? Can you give us a bit of background on your role?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Mike Healy. So Turner and Townsend, for those that aren't aware, work in providing professional services across real estate and infrastructure sectors worldwide. Background, project management, cost management, but notably digital services, supporting clients in the setup and delivery of those services. So I'm an associate director in our infrastructure digital business, leading our infrastructure information management service. So I'm here today to talk about some of the challenges, opportunities we face in on the ground at a project level on these engineering projects.
Amazing. Great to have you with us, Mike. You'll see, guys, I wasn't kidding. We really have got a fantastic expert panel here today. So really excited for the conversation that lies ahead. And we hope you guys get the most out of today's session. Before we go into the planned Q&A, I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting, as I said. I think with a topic like this, it's sometimes easy to question, why does it matter? Why does something as technical and almost sort of niche sounding as a digital twin matter? I think it's important to really take a step back at the start of the conversation. our built environment contributes to 40% of all carbon emissions worldwide. Now, on one level, that's quite depressing, but it's also a really big opportunity, because if we can change what we do in this industry, if we can build a better, more sustainable, and operate a better, more sustainable built environment, we can make a huge impact on the planet and a huge impact on what is one of the number one issues today, climate change. So that's why we're doing it. That's why it matters. I think that's important to keep in mind as we go through this conversation, and as we each ask ourselves the question, why should we be doing this, whether it's an organization, a business, or even a local authority or a national government. I'm not going to get into defining a digital twin. I'm very wary that I've got some fantastic experts on the call with me who are going to define that very clearly in a moment. But I think for those of you who aren't aware, what we're talking about here in very basic terms is creating a digital representation of a physical asset, in this case, a building. It could be a house, hospital, school, skyscraper in this case, you can see on screen, and creating a relationship between that physical asset and that digital model by sharing information or by collecting information from what's happening in the real world asset, so we can study that, look at it in a building performance model, that digital model, and start to optimize how we're using that building, whether in terms of energy use, people flow, all those sorts of things. Now, some of the examples, this is a fantastic diagram by IES, which really shows and gives you a feel for some of the different types of information that we can start to collect and bring into that building performance model, that digital model in the heart. Things like lighting information, HVAC loads, airflow, energy and carbon use, all those sort of pieces of data we're pulling in from that real world assets and looking at and studying in a digital model. Now, IES have got a few case studies on this. This is Singapore University over in Singapore. Again, you can see we've created a 3D model, a 3D virtual representation of the real world campus. And that enables us to start to see how buildings are performing, how we can start to optimize building performance across, in this case, quite a large university campus. IES then provide a whole range of dashboards. So again, you can start to see here some of the information that we can start to pull out from a building performance model. We can start to look at how energy is being used, when it's being used, electricity use, time of day. And again, we can start to really optimize how we're using our buildings to reduce our energy use and reduce our impact on the built environment, as well as reducing things like running costs and helping the bottom line. Another example here is a decarbonization roadmap. This is again a fantastic part of IES's software, where once you have that data, you can start to look at what some of the bigger capital or maintenance interventions you may want to make that can help you chart a pathway to decarbonising your built environment, to reducing the impact that your built asset or group of built assets might be having. So this is, again, we've scratched the surface here. We're going to dive into the conversation in much more detail now, but this is powerful stuff. There is a lot of potential with digital twins. And going back to what I said at the beginning, it really does matter, because if we can do this not just on a house or a group of houses or on a university campus, but across a city district, across a whole town, a whole city, a whole country, a whole region, we can really start to reduce the impact that we have through the built environment on this planet. And that matters. It matters for our children and our children's children, because we want to live in a cleaner and more sustainable world. So it's important. And I think keeping an eye on that big picture is really important as we go through the conversation. Last thing to point out to you is there is a free guide available by IES all about the practicalities of creating a performance digital twin. I genuinely can't recommend this highly enough. It's not too long. It's very easy to understand. It is a free download. We're going to share the download link in the comments shortly. But do go and have a look at that. It's really good for organizations who are looking to take that first step, create their first digital twin, and want to know what to think about. So highly recommend that guide. Now, at this point, I want to bring our panel back into the conversation, because, again, I'm conscious that they are the experts here and we want to get as much information out of them as we can. Richard, I want to come to you first. And again, this is a pretty obvious question to start this webinar with, but what is the definition of a digital twin? How would you define digital twin technology?
I think one of the key things for us in terms of the digital twin is identifying the purpose of the digital twin initially. There are different reasons why you may want to produce a digital twin of a building, but in IES's world, that really stems from the dynamic simulation physics-based performance model that has been developed at the building's design stage, which could be for compliance or optimization of the building. So the physical asset in our terms is the building. The digital asset that the digital twin stems from is the initial physics model. But then we need to go through a process to take that model and then develop it into a digital twin. Just because it is a model doesn't necessarily mean it is by default a digital twin of the building. And what we term that as a process called calibration, which involves either ensuring that the building is operating as per the model, or the model is operating as per the building. There's a subtle difference between the two depending on the use case, but that gives us an understanding that building is, or the digital twin is performing as per the building and will respond as per the building to any changes that we make. That then enables us to understand whether the building is operating as intended when compared to the digital twin, or use it as a sandbox for looking at future scenarios that we may want to impart onto that building, knowing that the digital twin simulation will be replicated by the physical building if those scenarios are impacted or deployed on that building in the future.
Fantastic. That's very clear. And Dan, I want to come to you because I know that the BSI actually have a very clear definition around what a digital twin is. Are you able to share that with us?
Yeah, sure, Fred. So we've do a lot of standards, as you know. We have got an international standard on digital twin concepts and terminology, which is ISO 30173. I've done some splashes vaguely around social media about it, so people might have heard of it before. But it has got a pretty good definition. And what it talks about is that a digital twin is a digital representation of target entities with data connections that enable convergence between the physical and digital states at an appropriate rate of synchronization. Now, that's incredibly technical, but you can break that down into target entity is stuff. So say that it's a digital representation, of a thing with data connections. And like Richard talked about there when he talked about the calibration bit, it's that convergence aspect of whether you're converging your physical to your digital or your digital to your physical in that way. So it can go both directions. And you just do it at an appropriate rate, because there's a lot of talk about real time in some of these situations. And if you want to be bored too much by me, that there's no such thing as real time, because by the time you've got latency and everything else, and actually it's not that useful quite often, because people don't need to know it on a second by second basis. It can be hour by hour, minute by minute, day by day, depending on what the data is. So it's about looking at that right rate of it. And I think what's quite interesting is that this aligns quite well with stuff that the government is saying. So people might have caught the work happening from the Department of Business and Trade and the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology around cyber physical systems, where they talked about digital models, digital shadows, and digital twins, where, as Richard started to point out, the model is the static thing. The digital shadow is that one-way connection where you might have some IoT sensors and pull some readings, but the digital twin is where you have that connection in both directions. So I think it's really positive to hear that, what we're talking about is the same thing, really. It needs to have data flow in both ways so that you're making the physical align with the digital and vice versa.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a lot of confusion out there. I think we've all come across that when you hear the term digital twin. It can sort of mean different things to different people, which again, I think is why this conversation is so important to have. But there's also sometimes a bit of conflation with building information modeling and other types of 3D information models. Emma, could you help clarify for us how does a digital twin differ from your standard BIM model or digital model?
Yes, Fred. Well, again, this all comes down to definitions and what you believe BIM is, because talking to different people, they have different perceptions of what BIM is. So I'm going to explain it, my take on it, so people can take this if they want to or not. So for me, it's all about information models. So we talk a lot about models, and I think immediately what springs to mind in most people's heads is a 3D model. Now, an information model to me doesn't necessarily have to be 3D. So a model is about how data connects to other data and its relationship. So I always think of it as like, those old school science molecule models where you've got little balls that are connected by rods to other balls. So that's how I see information, how I see models. You've got pieces of information or data being connected to other pieces of information or data. So once we start to think of it like that, that's really kind of what the digital representation of a facility is. And people can't really understand what these models are. just like that. They have to be filtered down, they have to be visualized, and that's where drawings come in, schedules, or if there is geometrical information embedded within these models, then we can visualize them in 3D, because we can respond to that better, because we see buildings all the time outside our windows. So for me, that's what a model is. So it's really important to understand that it doesn't have to be geometrical, and also that that model needs to be kept up to date, as Dan said, with the physical facility. And this could be down to more sort of human-based changes, such as there might be a refurbishment, there might be a replacement of a boiler, you might be maintaining a fan or inspecting a fire door. So that information always has to be updated within that information model, that asset information model, if we're following ISO 19650. So as long as that's up to date, that for me provides the foundations for what a digital twin then becomes, because then you can build on the performance aspect of it and the sensors and the IoT, the smart buildings layer. And then you've got the other layer where you've got the other way where the information flows from the physical to the digital asset, via actuators. So you've got that two-way flow as Dan described.
As we were saying, it really is it's that link between the digital and the physical. They're not in isolation to each other. There is that connection between them.
And it's all about that foundational model and getting that right, because if you don't get that right, then you haven't got that representation, and it's about keeping it up to date as well, and that's where information management comes in.
Indeed. I mean, Dan, coming back to you, this is a huge question, I know, but why do you think it is still so misunderstood and underutilized in construction? I mean, Emma kind of alluded to it with this mixed definitions around. I know BSI obviously very much in the market of setting the standard and setting clarity for people. Why is there this misunderstanding, do you think, about digital twins still?
I mean, it's difficult, and I don't want to paint anyone as the baddie in this situation, but I think what happens is a new technology comes around, and I think people tend to jump on it as it's something shiny and new, and there's almost like a magpie effect where people are drawn to something that's quite exciting. And you'll notice probably in the last 6 months or so, it's not been digital twins as such, it's been AI and bits and pieces. So that's become the new shiny in that respect. And I think it's about trying to understand correctly what things are. I think what's really telling is that in the early days of BIM, there were companies out there who would kind of claim what they were doing was a BIM model. Those same companies were then saying what they're doing is a digital twin, and those same companies are now saying what they have is an artificial intelligence optimized. So I think it's almost insert zeitgeist here sort of thing with it. But I think it's really interesting in trying to find the right place to use it and what the right data you're trying to collect is. And I think this is why the Singapore example you put up, I think is actually a really good example, because if you take what Emma said, that from a design and construction point of view, you might build the asset information model from a BIM perspective. You're capturing room areas, door locations, building levels, that sort of thing. But you'll notice none of that was the subject of that Singapore university model. It was energy ratings, it was occupancy, humidity, CO2, it was the internal environment. So you're actually measuring a very different data set in the digital twin. So when you look at my definition and talks about the target entity is the internal environment of that building or the energy performance of that building. And then you go, right, well, what data do I need to manage and monitor that? Because your door's not going to move, or hopefully it's not going to move, but the internal environment's in constant flux. So actually, you'll find quite often that what you want to twin digitally, it's very different to the building itself. It's what happens in the building or what the building facilitates. So in that way, it's not really, at least for me, in design and construction, it's very much in the operational side is where you get the real value. But that's only when you look at twinning buildings and assets, because you can also twin processes or twin systems. So a contractor could twin where their cranes are and do logistics and real-time monitoring of where all those bits and pieces are. Totally valid. I think that's a good digital twin use case. But people tend to think of it as BIM with extra bells on it, and I think that's where they get a bit confused or become susceptible to unfair marketing strategies.
I agree, and I think it's really, we can all relate to what you're saying, because these new technologies come along and we naturally talk about their total promise, all these amazing things they can do. And I think we each feel sometimes that we should all be doing that straight away. We should be doing the whole shooting match to start with. Whereas, and again, we'll come on to this a little bit later on, it's more about focusing on what is it you're trying to use digital twin to achieve, and approaching it from that perspective, your use, your business case, and building up from there, rather than trying to do everything on day one, which is inevitably a bit disappointing and can lead to a bit of inertia. So, yeah. Richard, before we move on, I want to ask you, digital twins are, I alluded to it again in my introduction, but how can they play a critical part in helping us decarbonize our built environment? How can they help us pave the way to bringing that 40% carbon emission number down?
I think initially it stems back to the question of, is my building performing as intended? Obviously, a building is designed for compliance and maybe optimization of systems, but then when you put humans inside that building, they can make decisions that don't necessarily align with the intent of that building. So you can compare the digital model against the output from the physical building initially to understand whether the two are in sync, and understand whether there may be some operational implications on how people are using the building that maybe steer it away from the design intent. I think it was mentioned earlier about the types of information that can feed into the digital model from the building, and that can include things like IoT, BMS information, or meter data. So you can take different data streams from the building itself, and then feed those back into the digital model to do that process. But then once you've got to the point where you do understand that you've optimized the energy from an operational perspective, you can then look at your potential decarbonisation roadmap, if you like. And that can be a series of, say, light and deep retrofits, and maybe looking at decarbonisation of the grid as part of that process. The advantage of using a digital twin there is that it really enables you to understand which interventions are going to have the greatest impact. So they may bring those decisions earlier in your decarbonisation process, but also it can de-risk investment decisions based on the return on that investment and the impact that has on the building, knowing that the different scenarios you've modelled as part of your decarbonisation plan have the intended effect when they will be applied to that building. So it's not necessarily the obvious choice of putting as much PV as you can on the roof, changing your LED lights and so on. It may be more nuanced than that, and you can use the digital twin to ensure that that's the case. I also think that, and I think Emma touched on this a little bit, it doesn't have to be a geometric model that's the data output from this. I think really it's an opportunity to put the right information in front of the right person in the right format, and that format could be alerts, or it could be graphical, or it could be geometrical, but it's ensuring that you're giving the data in the right way to get the intended outcome.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point, because there is a tendency to jump to modelling and to think it has to be 3D modelling and geometric stuff, as Emma alluded to earlier. But actually, in some of those dashboards I showed earlier on, you see there wasn't a geometric component. You just have the information displayed to you in a clear and informative manner, which at the end of the day is what you need. And Mike, I'm really keen to bring in your view and your experiences as well. What are some of the most common kind of misconceptions that you've experienced around digital twins on the ground in the industry? And can you help do a bit of myth busting for us? It'd be much appreciated.
Yeah, no problem. I think, in my opinion, in my experience, there's several. I think everyone has touched on some of them. The main one, in my point of view, is there's an underappreciation of the amount of enabling works required to gradually develop a digital twin. It is a journey. What you presented with Singapore University didn't come out the box that someone bought. It probably took years to develop that. So as mentioned, you can't buy a digital twin. There's lots of shiny tools on the market. The biggest challenge is not to rush into a solution. What is the problem you're trying to solve? If you've defined that, then you can work backwards to a solution. So often on a project level, a digital twin, the thought comes in a little bit too late. So we need to plan in the early days of a project, and then we can very gradually, step by step, build those robust information management foundations, start to implement 19650, defining our governance, data ownership, contracts built around that information to facilitate the digital twin. So taking into account the business's strategic vision. So what does that organization want to achieve in 5, 10, 20 years' time? Then creating a digital twin strategy aligned to that business vision is key. And then you can start to create a roadmap of what we're going to do when, before we jump into a technology. And engaging with non-technical people, decision makers, business leaders, is really key. And I think their key misconceptions is we see the shiny stuff and we get excited, but that's the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot of things that need to be done to facilitate that.
I couldn't agree more, and it brings me on nicely to the question I wanted to ask Emma, which is around, we have a number of clients on today's webinar, watching today's webinar, who are thinking about specifying a digital twin. They're thinking about asking for it on their projects for their built environment that they own and operate. What would you say are some of the key considerations they need to think about to make sure that the digital twin they're asking for actually aligns with their business needs and isn't just the all singing, all dancing bit of everything?
Yeah, it's based upon what Mike said. It's about good information management at the end of the day. And I always try and explain to clients that you've got to think of information as a really important asset. And like any other asset, it needs to be specified, it needs to be procured, it needs to be planned and checked and used properly. And it all starts within the organisation, not on projects. So you really do have to understand your business needs, really look at the processes and use cases, and then you can really start to identify actually where a digital twin would actually provide the most value. And from that, you can actually start to work out what information and data is required for that digital twin and start to build upon it in sort of layers and really think about how it impacts the business as well. So, having some kind of information management, resource within house is really important. And one of the things, you see a lot of is the whole, the CapEx side of development and the separate operational side. Well, when it comes to information, those two really do need to be joined up together to make this work. So really kind of looking at how information flows throughout your business, and that's the best starting point. And asking the question, why? Why is this needed? What are the purposes? And in addition to this as well, there's also a really important sort of aspect as well is looking actually how the information is connected when you get it. So really start to look at how information and how the relationships between it and what you call things and how it's classified is actually done independently of technology. And actually looking at the standards that are available to actually do this, because one of the things we're identifying at the moment, and I was talking to a smart buildings consultant about this, is that we're actually starting to see organisations being led by lots of proprietary ways of organising their information and connecting it. And this doesn't necessarily help the industry, because we'll end up with even more interoperability problems than we have at the moment. So it's really looking at the sort of open data standards, for instance, like Building Smart promotes and manages, that they're there to kind of help this and to stop the interoperability problems. Because when it comes to information, I always think of the industry as one organisation, because we're all constantly exchanging and sharing information between each other. And if that's all in different formats and different languages and structured differently, then it can't talk to each other. So we really have to think about that and really do your homework with regards to what data standards are already out there in the industry.
No, well said. I think it's a really important point to be clear on. I think, again, for clients listening, it's not about just asking for a digital twin for the sake of it because you think you should have one in this day and age. But as Emma said, going back to what is it as an organisation that you are trying to measure, monitor and optimize? What information do you need to enable you to do what you're trying to do, and specifying just that within your digital twin, not trying to do everything from day one. And Richard, again, on this kind of notion of the fact we have got several clients watching, we've talked a little bit about how they should approach this. On the business case side, can you give us an example of how a digital twin has made a really big impact on a building project?
Yes, certainly. And the example I'll probably lean into is a university project, because there's certain stages that you go through on a campus-based project that enables you to find out where the greatest impact is going to be initially. So universities are clients that have different challenges. They have an existing estate that can be buildings of varying ages with various uses. It can be laboratories, it can be lecture theatres and so on. And they also have a a client base, the students who take a great deal of ownership of the university they go to. They use it as a sense of identity. So that means that when you're looking at maybe doing a refurbishment or decarbonisation plan, there's different stakeholders and different challenges that you may have within that type of organisation that may mean that you need to be quite specific in terms of what you do with regard to impact on that campus. Generally, we'd use a digital twin initially, or initial model, to identify the worst performing buildings within that campus or within that estate. And that gives us a good idea of where we can create the greatest impact by leveraging a digital twin. So the first challenge statement is, which out of my, say, 300 buildings should I implement this technology on? So that means you're looking at utilising the technology in the right way. It's going to have the greatest impact. In terms of a specific client that we've worked with on this kind of project, the University of Liverpool is one of our initial clients, really taken the digital twin element and then utilised that through the IES Live dashboard system that you showed a little earlier with your introductory slides. They took a building that we did various refurbishment scenarios and particularly concentrating on the HVAC. And running those through a digital twin meant that when we started to do the comparison between the simulated results and the actual results from that building, the simulated results were that they had a 14% energy reduction. We actually managed to achieve 24% in actual verified energy savings, but the significant energy savings were stemmed from the ability to be able to test those scenarios out and ensure that the route that we were going to take was the most effective one for that building. But also with the university campus project, we have the ability to then federate digital twins by aggregating data across the buildings. So I can identify how one building is performing and maybe how it can be improved, or I can look at it as a group of buildings and see, as in the aggregate, am I reducing energy across that portfolio? And that's where it kind of leans into having buildings of different types, where you may have to overperform on one building to make up for the fact that you may be limited in the interventions you can do on another. So I think it was an interesting project in terms of working with that particular client type, because the challenges are relatively unique in that instance.
Absolutely. It's really compelling listening to you, because it first off, it gives you that visibility, doesn't it? For the first time for many of these organizations, they can actually see what's happening in their built environment, which isn't always a given. But then also the ability to optimize, not just to reduce the carbon impact of buildings, but also to improve the bottom line of organizations is, at the end of the day, a very useful aspect of this.
The environmental, or the environment that you are occupying, and it's not just about energy and carbon. There's the well-being element as well. It touched on CO2 sensors, humidity sensors, and so on. So understanding the actual environmental conditions as well as the energy performance is an added value, effectively, from the kind of project work we've done.
Absolutely. Now we want to turn to the live Q&A section now, guys. So do your questions coming in using the Q&A feature here on Zoom. We're going to get through as many of them as we can. We are then going to come back to the panel, because I want to ask each of them, I'm going to give them a heads up here. I want to ask each of them what their one piece of advice is they would give to the audience today to leave with around digital twins, around how to get started and what to think about. So we'll come to that at the end. Before that, as I said, we're going to get into the Q&A. I'm going to start with one that's been emailed through to us early this morning. This is from Nathan Hayes, who's an assistant engineer at Atkins. He asks, does the fact that the use of digital twins and generally BIM as a whole still hasn't filtered right through the industry, particularly to smaller clients, including local government authorities, help fuel the misconceptions? If they haven't tried it, they don't truly know what it is. Mike, I'd like to ask you first of all, do you think that's part of the misconceptions?
In my experience, I think that's fair, because as we know, technology doesn't come cheaply. It massively reduces long-term costs, without a doubt, but it does have high upfront costs, and we need information managers, as Emma alluded to. We need people that understand the information, understand the project, what you're doing. So you need domain and digital experts. You also need to pay for the licenses and those sorts of things. So there are high upfront costs, and that absolutely is a barrier to people like local authority or smaller members in the supply chain. But that's why events like this come in handy, as much as we can make this available to people, increasing that visibility to technical people as well as non-technical people, business leaders, is really key to let people know what's out there and how we can tweak it to fit the needs of the wide supply chain.
Absolutely. What's been your experience with this, Emma? Do you think is that part of where the misconceptions and confusion comes from?
Well, I mean, with BIM and all this stuff, you know, it all, like I said, it starts with information, and you don't need to spend a lot of money to manage information. You know, even just understanding, you know, having a consistent way of naming it to find it is a start, and getting those basic principles in order actually then help. And there is a lot of even open source software out there at the moment, so you don't necessarily have to spend lots and lots of money on really shiny, you know, technology to do these things. Start small, do your research, see what's out there, and actually you might be able to come up with a solution that doesn't cost the earth. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a barrier, because, you know, the standards, especially the open standards, are there, you know, to make it accessible to more people.
Excellent, very well said. Richard, we've got a question come in here from a chap called Liam Wood, who says, can you expand on the decarbonisation roadmap? How can this be applied to, say, an estates master plan where you consider reuse, refurb and offload?
So the decarbonisation roadmaps that we produce are basically geared towards the end client's net zero goals, and provide a pathway for them to understand what interventions they need to be able to implement for them to be able to achieve it. In terms of how that can be applied to an estate, it links a little bit back to the federation approach. When we work with clients that have multiple buildings and a decarbonisation commitment that they make, so say for 2050, for instance, understanding the pathways individually is useful, but when you start to aggregate it across the estate, then that gives much more clarity in terms of the net impact, and maybe the purchasing and implementation strategy you may want to apply across a portfolio of buildings rather than looking at them individually. So I think that's the question.
Good answer. And I've got another question here from Simondeep saying, what is your experience working with equipment manufacturers such as air handling units, chillers and cooling towers? How are you finding their integration with digital twins? I think this is a really important question. So we're talking about taking information and data from that physical asset into a, whether it's a digital model, geometric or not, a digital dashboard, a source of information. How have you found that's going with supply chain in terms of components, systems, BMS systems, and the linking between the physical and the digital? I mean, I guess probably start with Richard again, if that's okay, on the IS side.
That's fine. So in terms of systems within the model, we do work with equipment manufacturers to ensure their systems are represented with their performance curves within the model that we create as part of the design process. In terms of then, and this kind of is a bit of a spoiler for the question you were going to ask about what the takeaway is, the model and the building individually don't become a digital twin without the data stream between the two. The data is obviously the critical part between that. In terms of how that data is then consumed by the model, we and other people do provide platforms that enable to aggregate data from different sources into one data stream that then can be fed into the digital twin. So it can be different data formats from different suppliers in terms of how they want to create data and communicate it, but we can create a consistent flow of information through one of our integration tools. It's a product called iScan that just takes the information through from the different streams. That feeds into the digital twin, and that enables the digital twin to consume the information. So it's not just that we have a platform, there are others, but there are applications there that enable that ease of that data flow between one and the other. And there are standards in terms of how that data is represented as well.
Fantastic. Another question that's coming now from an anonymous attendee, which sounds a bit ominous, but hopefully it's not too ominous. They're asking, how is a digital twin different from an energy model or an operational energy model? I feel that's one of Dan, Mike or Emma, if any of you want to jump at such a tough question.
I mean, I'll have a go, and I'll say, and the cop-out answer is it might not differ. And I think the point is that sometimes definitions aren't mutually exclusive. And I think the interesting one, I think when I wrote an article on some of the digital twin stuff, I made a comparison with the Met Office's interactive weather map, and trying to say, well, is that a digital twin? And things can have more than one name in that sense. And I think all you really need to do is look at, there are probably two sides to it. One is the characteristics of the definition, where you can say, well, is it a representation of a thing? Are there data connections? Does it enable convergence? In which case, if you're using those energy models to tweak and optimize what you're doing in the real world, then yeah, it very well could be a digital twin in that sense. But I'd also then mirror the point that I think Mike and others have made, which is if you start with purpose and you're making something that's useful, does it even matter if it's a digital twin or not? If you've invested in some form of tech stack that's helping you optimize or do your performance better, and if someone like me turns around and says technically that's not a digital twin, you can turn around and say, well, it gives me value, so I don't care, Dan. So I wouldn't get too worried in what things are called, as long as you're clear, that definitions do exist and they can impact on procurements or services or other things, but get the thing you need for the value for your business, I think, is the ultimate point of that.
Yeah, I agree with Dan on that. I would love to get rid of buzzwords because they just cause a lot of problems. It's always about the definitions behind them and is it providing value to your business and organisation. And at the end of the day, if it does that, then yeah, it's doing its job.
Just to add to that as well, yeah, echoing those comments, but in a project delivery environment, there's people that are technical, digital like ourselves, but also people that have heard of BIM as a buzzword and don't really care about it, and that's okay. And if they're talking about they want a digital twin, but they're not actually talking about a digital twin, rather than shutting them down and saying, no, that's not correct, let's encourage it, because the industry is talking about it, is moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. I think recognizing that we're all on this journey of understanding what this is and how the technology applies is really important. And like you say, that sort of teenage culture of all thinking that someone else knows more than you do and pretending that you know more than the other person is a bit immature and not very helpful. So if you're listening to that, please take that away. Another an observation rather than a question from a chap called Casey Rutland, who I think many people on this call will know, and many people watching will know. So Casey says, an observation rather than a question. Where cost is a perceived barrier, that's where the business case comes in. It has to prove itself. He says the UK's Centre for Digital Built Britain published a digital twin business case toolkit, which is a really helpful tool. So do go and have a look at that, guys. But he says it's ultimately asking, is a digital twin even needed? Which I think is a really good question to ask at this stage, just because everyone else has one, or they're fashionable, as Dan alluded to earlier, because they happen to be in the zeitgeist right now. It might not necessarily be the right thing for your business. So I think that's a really good takeaway. Another question from an anonymous attendee. This one's for you, Richard. He says, if the University of Liverpool has used a digital twin for retrofitting and decarbonising their built assets, is that more similar to a digital shadow than a digital twin? Would that be closer to a digital twin for design rather than a digital twin for operations? And this is a common distinction made in practice.
So I'll lean back into one of the questions that's just been asked in terms of what the difference between an energy model and a digital twin is in this context, and that maybe will explain the process a little bit more. So an energy model could be developed for compliance, but for compliance there may be some assumptions in there that aren't necessarily as enacted in the real world. So how do you then form a digital twin based on that compliance model? You take data from the building to replace those assumptions with actual data. And that's the information feeding from the building back into the digital twin to ensure that the digital twin is operating as it removes any of the assumed data with actual data from the building. That then enables you to have the convergence between the digital and physical asset, that you can then look at the refurbishment scenarios back the other way to understand what the impact would be back to the building. So effectively taking information from the building first, replace any assumptions that are in the model with actual data, then utilise that to feed information, to create information that then can provide the scenarios back to the building that then can be enacted on the physical asset.
Good answer. We have a lot of questions coming in. We've now got 66, which I think is testament to the the interest and / confusion around the subject area. So some of them are quite basic, but I think it's important to get through and ask these. We'll try to get through as many as we can. Question from Dale saying, can a BIM model be used to inform and develop a digital twin? So can you use your BIM model as a basis for your digital twin? Emma?
Yes, but it depends what data's in the model. And this is why it should all be started and, worked out, within organisations before projects, are started, because then you can then make sure that you've got the right information in your information requirements, and you're asking for the right information, you're procuring it in the right way, to then actually at the end of the project you make sure you've got the right data in that model. So it all depends on the scenario. Obviously you can add data to it. So yeah, it just all depends, I suppose, on what the variables are. But it's the foundations for it. So yeah.
Good.
And also what the definition of BIM is.
Well, that's a whole other webinar. That's a whole other 10-year industry period, really. Anyway, another anonymous question coming in here. My organisation is a large retailer with a varied estate. We have a detailed model of our average store in CAD, Revit, and a building management system, which we mostly use for building standards and implementation costing. I'm trying to work out if we need a digital twin or if we just need to use our data better. How does the panel think an organisation can establish if it's really worth the effort?
No, I'll interrupt and have a go with it. And I think is the trap I think a lot of people fall into is the mindset of that question is, do I need a piece of technology? And I think actually that the real question needs to be, what problem are they trying to solve? And then, as I think Mike talked about, working backwards to work out what's needed. And I think a great example of something I've heard people use before is people can say it's quite expensive to set up sensors and do other bits and pieces, but you can cheat sometimes with aggregate data. And a great example is you can use the amount of mobile devices that are logged onto your Wi-Fi as an aggregate for the occupancy in a building. So, if you were a large retailer and you wanted to work out roughly how busy your stores were, having a free Wi-Fi and then using the number of how many people logged onto the free Wi-Fi could give you an idea of which stores are busier, which is a very inexpensive way of getting a rough figure to do that. And then at which point, if that's the question you need answering, you don't need a digital twin for that. But if it's a lot more complicated and some of the use cases we saw from the IES performance model is the sort of level of detail they need, then it could be that a more complicated set of things is needed to do that. But I think the question really is, well, what are they trying to do better and what's needed to do that thing better?
Couldn't agree more. Some really good questions coming in. I think they're really covering off some important points. This one's from a chap called Thomas Hill. And I love this question. How is data typically transferred to a digital twin from the building and reverse? How does it go back again? I know it might sound fundamental, but I think that's a really important one to answer. How does it get from the physical building into your digital model? Richard? So
I mentioned briefly earlier, we have a platform that sits between the two. And it's able to, it's actually quite a ubiquitous platform in that it just effectively takes data and then creates a data stream of that data that can be fed into, that can be consumed by the model. So it's almost a bridge between the built asset and the model that enables that data flow. Now, exactly how that happens, it could be any internet connection, effectively wired or wireless, that enables that data flow. But it's usually you need a bridge technology between the two to be able to take that data across from one to the other.
And I imagine there are certain cybersecurity considerations that go with that as well, with transfer of data, depending on the asset.
There is, and in certain instances, we have done local deployments rather than using cloud-based technology for that particular reason, to hold the data within a particular network.
Good to know. We've got 76 questions and 11 minutes, so we're going to ask a couple more, and then we're going to come to our panel to wrap up. This is a really good one from a chap called Brian Linder, who says, as a manufacturer, how can I ensure that my products currently gathering information and reporting it via an app or web page can be used in different digital twin platforms or software? I'm going to see who jumps first.
I'll have a go. Without going into the specifics of a particular solution, the first thing is take a step back. is your information structured? What rules have you got in place about how you're tagging your products? Have they got a unique identifier? All those things, where they're coming from, but is that being tagged across your organization in the same way? So everyone's calling the same thing the same name. If you've got that structured data, you know what it's telling you, regardless of what software it sits in. And then again, avoid jumping to a software. Why do you want to know that? Think backwards. Do you want to reduce costs? Do you want to, whatever, better decision making based on that information? Structure it. Where's that information sitting? Is it on your estate? Is it on a supplier's estate? How long do you want it there for? What's your retention policy? All those governance things to define. Work that out before you then go, what software do I want?
Absolutely. We have time for one last question, which I'm going to ask from Peter. Again, this is a really important part of the conversation for me. He's asking, do you make the digital twin model accessible to building occupants, say on personal workstations or on public information panels, or do you keep it restricted to building management staff? And for me, this really touches on the point about engaging more people, making more people aware of how we use and operate our built environments. Emma and Richard, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on the purpose and what it is that the occupiers need to know. So you can, do it so show them the information in a way that they only see that information that they need to know. And it goes back to housing as well for residents. They might want to see information that's relevant to them. So it's all about, looking at the different user groups and what's relevant to them and working back from that to understand what information they need and delivering it to them in a way that they can consume as well. Because everybody consumes information in different ways. Some people can read a 2D drawing, some people like a nice 3D model, some people might want a schedule. So again, it's understanding that yes, you've got this model, but you don't have to share the whole of it with everybody. It's, again, back to those purposes, and that's the key.
Yeah, just to follow on from Emma, I completely agree. It's the purpose of the information that you are displaying. And in some cases, if you're looking at reporting on ESG metrics that you want to publicise and people to be able to see live, then you can, publicise that information to a wider audience. There may be information that really is for the building manager, for them to be able to change set points or whatever it may be within the building itself. So it's the use case, I would say, that you can define the information that's presented.
Absolutely. We're going to wrap up now. I want to ask each of the panelists that final question. But before we do that, I just want to highlight that the BSI have very kindly offered a 50% discount on their standard, which relates to digital twins. There is a discount code that's being posted in the chat right now. It's there for you. So a big thank you to Dan and the team at BSI for doing that. I believe the standard, the actual name, and I'm reading this off my notes, I don't know the standard as well as Dan does, but it is BS ISO IEC 30173. Is that right, Dan?
Yeah, that's the one. Well done.
That could have been embarrassing if I got that wrong, but very good. Guys, do go and have a look at that. That's a 50% discount exclusively for attendees of this webinar. It is there for you in the webinar chat. Hopefully you can see that along with the link to go and download that free guide from IES. That code's available for 3 months. So 3 months from today's date. So do go and make use of that. 2 great documents there to get you started on your digital twin journey. Now, before we go, I know we've covered, this is a huge topic. We've covered a lot of different things today. I want to boil it down to one clear takeaway from each of you. What would you say to people listening, going away from today? What would your one piece of advice be to them on how to get started when it comes to digital twins in the industry? Can I start with Emma first? Is that right?
That's fine. Don't be scared of it. At the end of the day, it all boils down to information, and it's all about purpose. So if you identify what those purposes are, what decisions you need to make, what questions you need to answer, that will start you off on the right track. And remember to look at your information requirements and make sure it's all joined up within that. And if you've got smart building consultants, if you've got information managers, BIM people, they all need to come together because they're not separate at all. It all interlinks and it's all interconnected. So yeah, that's where I would start with.
Don't be scared. Good advice. Very good. Mike, how about yourself?
Use cases. and a digital twin strategy, avoid the technology, plan it out, think about everything first before you start looking at technology. Why do you want it? What's your plan to get there? Walk before you run.
Very good. There are some fantastic sound bites coming out here. This is amazing. No pressure, Dan. What's your advice?
I mean, my advice is going to be ironic coming from me, but I'm going to say talk to the people who are doing it, not to the people who are talking about it. And one really good example is that the Department of Business and Trade has got their Isle of Wight digital twin demonstrator program. So as part of the National Digital Twin program, they sat there and gone, you know what, talking about it is easy, doing it is hard. So they're actually using the Isle of Wight as a test bed at modeling the island's electricity network and the exchange of information between businesses there. And I think, seeing, as Mike said, talk about use cases and actually demonstrators of people trying to do it, that's where you find the difficulties, you get the problem solving, and you can really see the value. So I think, as opposed to talk to consultants less and talk to people who are doing it more.
Good advice. Richard, how about you?
I think I touched on it slightly. It all stems down to the availability of data. So if you have your purpose, as Mike mentioned, you have your stakeholder engagements and the people in the organisation understanding the purpose of what you're trying to do. I think Emma touched on. But when you have all of those pieces in place, ensuring that the data is available to be able to connect one to the other is the key element, and effectively that's what makes it a digital twin, isn't it?
Well said. Well, some fantastic advice there to close us out from a really fantastic and well-informed panel. I want to say a huge thank you to Emma, Mike, Dan, and Richard for being a part of this today. We couldn't have done this without you. And your insight and expertise has been genuinely really, really useful for everyone that's been tuning in. So thank you all for being here and for making the time. Also, a very big thank you to IES for working with the B1M to bring this webinar into fruition. A big thank you to IES for sharing that free guide. Again, the link is down there in the chat. We'll be sharing that afterwards with attendees as well. Same with the discount code for BSI. It is EVE Digital Twin 50, all one word in block caps in case you can't see it for any reason, but it is there in the chat as well. And finally, a very big thank you to all of you for watching today and tuning in. Wherever you may be in the world, we really appreciate that. This will be available to watch online. It'll be available to watch afterwards. You can get access to that either via IES or on the B1M Live YouTube channel in time. So yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining this conversation, and we'll hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.